The Reverend Emily Gage serves as the Minister of Faith Development of the Unity Temple Unitarian Congregation of Oak Park, Illinois. She is a representative of the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association on the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. Reverend Gage told us she wrote this sermon in 2007. Now she is looking forward to interacting with her church community in person. She didn't realize how much they give her sustenance. I thought I would spend my time in prison contemplating deep moral and ethical issues. But as I stood in the empty segregation cell in Statesville Correctional Facility near Joliet, Illinois, all I could think of was what were my surroundings. I noticed the 2 metal slabs for beds, the sink, and the tiny window. The cement walls loomed large and pressed close toward me. I was only there for a visit. I could leave the cell at any time, and still I felt trapped. But I was not alone. I was with a colleague, a prison chaplain who has worked there for years. We were there to speak to an inmate the chaplain needed to see. And I witnessed in this moment something I will never forget. It felt like a great gift. The chaplain listened and talked to the inmate as a person. He acknowledged his inherent worth and dignity. Maybe it doesn't sound like much, but especially in prison, with all the security concerns, we can only too easily forget that there are real people on the other side of the bars. The second principle of Unitarian Universalism, justice, equality, and compassion in human relations, is a natural and inevitable outgrowth of the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Why else would we treat others with compassion? Why else would we work to promote justice and equity? Inherent worth and dignity are the foundation for our ethical behavior. I once preached a sermon on truth that challenged me to come up with the 5 truths to live by. One of them is this: everyone deserves to be treated with compassion and respect. This has served as a steady, helpful reminder. Just as we forget that the people behind bars are real people, we too easily forget that the cashier at the grocery store is also a real person with internal struggles and feelings. We forget that the people driving so slowly ahead of us have other things on their minds. We've all been in that position. I sometimes talk in a less than kind and compassionate manner to the driver who does a seemingly inexplicable maneuver, but I try most of the time. In any case, this truth that everyone deserves compassion and respect is a combination of the first 2 principles. And yet, just believing something doesn't mean it's not a challenge to live up to. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Who sets out in the morning with that as their goal? It's a huge statement. There's a lot to it. The second principle is sometimes translated in various ways to give our children and young people a better grasp of its meaning. People should be treated equally, or fairly, or kindly and fairly, or be kind in all you do. It is almost too big to capture in different words. I had always wanted to go to prison. I serve a community that is known as a prison town because there are a number of correctional facilities in the area. I drive by several of them on a regular basis. Stateville looks like an elegant, well-groomed estate, large enough to warrant its own water tower. Joliet Correctional Facility looks like a castle made of local limestone quarried and built by prisoners themselves. The guard towers stand sentry, and there's even a small moat on one side of the land. The Joliet Youth Facility meets a street with endless rings of wire, Down the road, the River Valley Justice Center stands innocuously on another gorgeously manicured lawn. These institutions are omnipresent, yet their design reflects a pervasive attitude. These buildings are not to be approached. What happens there is of another world. Such an attitude causes us to forget that the people within are part of our larger community. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations points us towards something beyond inherent worth and dignity. It points us to the larger community. It gets a collective responsibility. It reminds us that treating people as human beings is not simply something we do one-on-one, but something that has systemic implications and can inform our entire cultural way of being. Before going to prison, I interviewed a number of people in my congregation who work in the correctional system. It was part personal odyssey, part research for a presentation to my minister's study group. I was struck by the way the interviewees spoke of their work and the people they worked among. Each of them had a sense of justice, equity, and compassion, though they might not have articulated it in that particular way. Perhaps more accurately, they had some sense of compassion, some sense of inherent worth of each prisoner, which led them to lift up issues of justice and equity. These interviews led me to questions of justice and equity also. Karen, who taught poetry to incarcerated adolescent girls, talked about how she made a point of calling each girl by her name. Many of the guards knew the girls only by their crimes. Karen was under orders to confiscate poetry the girls wrote in which they expressed their unhappiness or anger. The poems were to be given to the guards. Instead, Karen pocketed a lot of these poems, since her whole reason for being there was to help the girls express their true selves. Another congregant, Mary, has witnessed terrible inconsistencies at Statesville. She told this story. On Monday, we were selling jeans in the commissary. 2 days later, we were taking those same jeans away from the inmates. We did the same with electronics and hot coils to heat up water. We would take their money on Monday, and by Wednesday, we were writing them tickets for having the things they bought with it. When I asked Larry what informed his work, he said, fairness, honesty, and consistency. I'm the same person every day. I treat people the way I want to be treated. Sometimes Larry saw people in prison whom he knew from the outside. They always wanted special treatment. He never gave it to them. In those moments, he carried out justice and equity as best as he could in that context. Doing so is not always easy when you're working in a system that doesn't share the same values you do. Compassion is something that we can easily act on individually. We can demonstrate openness, give people respect, and treat people with kindness on our own. But we need one another to achieve equity and justice.
I recently went on a Southern civil rights tour. It was a life-changing experience for me. Although I was born just after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, the civil rights era has always been important to me. The seeds were sown in me at a very young age as I was bused to an African-American neighborhood for elementary school. I learned about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks probably before I knew about George Washington. Going to the South on this trip made all these events that I had read and heard about all my life come vibrantly alive. One day we gathered in Selma, Alabama, among the George Washington Carver homes, just down the street from the Brown Chapel AME Church, whose members and building played a key role in the marches of 1965. Our local guide was Joanne Bland, who had been an active young person in the civil rights movement in that era. We stood on a piece of cement where people had gathered and prayed before setting off to march on what was to become known as Bloody Sunday. She asked each of us to pick up a rock that we found on the ground. They were mostly pebbles. I picked one up and held it. She asked each of us if it was heavy. Then she did the oddest thing. She came around and looked in our hands at the rocks. "Oh," she said, peering into one hand, "that's the rock that Hosea Williams had. That's a lot of responsibility." She made similar comments as she looked into other hands. As I stood there, I felt that what she was saying was absolutely true. She said we could keep those rocks in a place where we could see them every day. She said they would remind us to work for justice and remind us of our history, our responsibility, our legacy. The pebble I collected that day in Selma sits on my dresser. It looks small, but it's powerful. It's more powerful because it carries a collective power from the past, from the present, and for the future. I feel blessed by the work of those who fought for justice and equity in those days. I stand amazed by their strength as I hear their stories of fighting for freedom. And I'm struck by the fact that they have not stopped fighting. Once you get a taste for what you need to fight for, you just keep on doing it. The world can always be a better place. People can always be treated better than they are. Recently, our church co-sponsored a marriage equality forum with the American Civil Liberties Union of Illinois. One panel included 3 same-sex couples who talked about their lives and the particular challenges they face. We have a dream that same-sex marriage will become a legal reality in this state, in our country, and around the world. As a minister, I have officiated at a number of same-sex commitment ceremonies. I bear witness to these relationships, and I tell you that same-sex marriage is a reality in every way. The problem is that others don't see that reality. The denial is manifested in all sorts of ways. The school secretary is hesitant to let the other mother pick up her daughter at school. The hospital declares that only immediate family can enter, keeping the partner out. Separate health insurance policies are required, and so on. Some of these things happen because people don't exhibit compassion and understanding. Some happen because of legal barriers. If we learn to walk in another's shoes, if we see each other as real people, we act compassionately. And when that becomes true, we are motivated to work for justice and equity. It is also true that when we change laws, we help people change their attitudes as well. When same-sex relationships are legally recognized, people will be given a new basis for understanding. Our Marriage Equality Forum was the first of its kind in our county. Participants came not only from our congregation, but from all over our community. For a long time, it felt like our congregation was alone in affirming bisexual, gay, lesbian, and transgender people and their rights. Then we became a welcoming congregation, certified as deliberately inclusive through the voluntary Unitarian Universalist Association program, and we hung a rainbow flag outside our building. That gentle public witness has helped others to find us, and we no longer feel isolated. It has also helped us continue our own journey of discovery. From focusing within, we have moved along the path toward more justice and equity. We are working on changing hearts and minds, as well as laws and policies. This is not something we can do alone. It is something that becomes more and more powerful as we gain in numbers. Justice, equity, and compassion are all part of the same package. Just as the second principle overlaps with the first, so it is related to the seventh principle, the interdependent web of all existence. I didn't spend a lot of time contemplating deep moral and ethical issues at the prison, perhaps because the experience was just too visceral, but I certainly have since then. After talking to a number of people and after my own glimpse of life on the inside, I wonder what we are doing in our prisons. We're certainly not rehabilitating those on the inside, and some of them have never been habilitated in the first place through no fault of their own. Even more significantly, we are not equipping inmates with survival skills for life on the outside. In other words, we're not providing equitable opportunities for inmates. We're not investing in them. This is neither just nor compassionate, and it demonstrates a lack of systems thinking. The less we help people get ready for life on the outside, the more likely they are to return. We would be wiser to provide real care and assistance to inmates. Instead, we treat them as though they are not real people with potential for change. We invest in more prisons with more punitive measures, compounding the problem rather than looking at the system itself. Some might argue that all this is justice, but it is certainly not equitable. Any cursory glance at the demographics of prisoners compared to the society at large will easily demonstrate how certain populations are disproportionately incarcerated. In our Unitarian Universalist tradition, we uphold the power of the question. We constantly search for truth and meaning. The second principle of justice, equity, and compassion serves as an excellent tool for that questioning. If we can't get up each day and say to ourselves, today I'm going to practice justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, we can at least look at the world around us and ask that question. Does this institution practice justice, equity, and compassion? This question has served as a helpful lens to me as I've contemplated our prison system, our civil rights history, and our current civil rights struggles, such as marriage equality. It's a guide for how to proceed and what the ultimate goal would look like. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations is a high calling, but that does not excuse us from trying to live it as best we can. Everyone deserves to be treated with compassion and respect. That's a start. If we begin by treating each person we meet as a human being, the practice just keeps on spreading. If we do it for one another, we are likely to pass it on further. If each person feels called to that sort of treatment, we start creating systems and institutions that reflect the same attitude. Soon, we are living justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. So may it always be.